AfriForum's court victory against forced quarantine has placed greater scrutiny on interventions by health authorities to curb the spread of the coronavirus. A case in Limpopo involving 2 doctors forced into quarantine ended when the Limpopo High Court ordered their release. Now, the doctors had tested positive for coronavirus and were forced into quarantine at a local camp. These actions have led to questions around the rights of both medical workers and ordinary citizens regarding self-isolation and quarantine. Dr. William Oosthuizen is the head of legal at the South African Medical Association and joins us now via our Zoom line. Doc, thanks very much for your time. Welcome to the AM Report. You've been quite involved in the case involving the 2 medical doctors in Limpopo. In many respects, many people are already saying that a precedent had been set when the Limpopo High Court ordered their release. What's your reaction to yesterday's Pretoria High Court ruling?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I hope everyone's staying safe in these unprecedented times. I think the ruling yesterday was a victory for common sense. Those that are able to self-isolate should be allowed to do so. It is, of course, important to strike a balance between the individual's rights and public interests, and any balance should be struck in a justified and rational manner.
Yeah, and what were some of the, legal considerations to be made? I know part of the argument was that doctors in particular should be allowed to self-isolate because they have the know-how insofar as they're able to take care of themselves versus any other ordinary citizen. I don't imagine that alone is enough to treat doctors any differently.
Yes, no, there are a couple of considerations that one would take into account. Biomedical ethics is based on 4 major principles: autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and distributive justice. So when a person is quarantined for a communicable disease, they are entitled to ethical care and the right to make choices about their treatment, which is, of course, autonomy. And it may be argued that quarantine constitutes an unwarranted infringement of their personal liberty. However, it may also be argued that it is an integral aspect of communicable disease control and therefore leads to distributive justice. But again, care for a person being quarantined should be more beneficial than consequential and should not cause more harm. In addition, the principles of harm, proportionality, reciprocity, and transparency should apply to quarantine. So a number of constitutional rights, of course, also come into the fray when you speak of forced quarantine.
Yeah, you spoke about public interest just a short moment ago. I remember a case where a man who had tested positive for coronavirus in Alexandra was found to have traveled across provinces to Limpopo, and there were real fears about, obviously, his impact on the pandemic and its subsequent spread. There's definitely something to be said about the state, at least, being able to intervene to prevent things like those taking place, surely.
No, definitely. And provision is made for that under the National Health Act and the regulations that have been published under that. Those that are unwilling or unable to self-isolate, there are measures. You apply to the court because it is such an infringement on their personal liberties and their rights. That is why those processes are in place, so that it goes through a judicial process because you are infringing on their rights. And that is the route that one would want to follow. You wouldn't want a blanket policy stating that everybody that tests positive should now be self-quarantined, because the effect that has on the chilling effect on testing, as well as the detrimental effect on the use of scarce resources.
Yeah, it's also, I guess, a good moment to try and speak about ways through which the housing setup in the country simply isn't an enabler for people to be able to effectively self-quarantine. Again, Alex, Orlando and Soweto being a few examples that are a case in point. Are we running the risk of essentially the treatment of COVID-19 patients being divided across racial lines? Because, for instance, not racial lines, class lines, I beg your pardon. Because if, for instance, there's a perception that people aren't necessarily able to quarantine in the township, it might create a pattern where they're not allowed to quarantine at home because of the social distancing concerns. Speak to us about those potential complexities.
Oh, that is a major, major concern. Of course, every citizen in this country, every person in this country are entitled to their constitutional rights, equality, human dignity, etc. The ruling yesterday, or the order that was made, indicates that you are able to self-quarantine if you've got access to a separate room. Now, of course, the reality in South Africa is that unfortunately, a large majority of our people unfortunately just don't have access to that separate room and would therefore be unable to effectively self-isolate and would then, where not possible to self-isolate, be forced into quarantine. And of course, we will perhaps see that it is divided among class lines, and that is a major concern. And also, it just emphasizes how important it is that we respect the rights of all people, and we implement these measures in a way which is as least intrusive as possible.
Yeah, and do you think yesterday's court ruling failed to adequately address that complexity?
I don't necessarily think so. I think the court ruling was a positive step. It clarified the regulations that were published under the Disaster Management Act. As I mentioned earlier, there are regulations in place under the National Health Act that actually provides for this type of scenario. And those types of measures would have to be considered by the court, and the actual realities of the person concerned need to be taken into account. So I don't think that this ruling necessarily failed to take that into account. I think it provides clarity, and it says to us that if you are unable to self-isolate effectively, then there is a risk that you might be forced into quarantine. But it also lets the authorities know that they need to consider the rights of the people and also do it in the least intrusive way possible.
The court ruling also presents a great opportunity to speak about the quarantine sites, or the state of quarantining in the country, if I can coin that term. We had seen reports, I think it was earlier, it must have been late last month, where people who had been repatriated from elsewhere around the world, brought into the country, were taken to really shoddy quarantine sites provided by the state. Yet we had also learned that part of the reason behind the lockdown was to buy time to prepare things like quarantine sites and beds. Your assessment of government's, I guess, strides, if any, in the procurement of quarantine sites and the standard and state in which they're in?
Well, unfortunately, and I mean anecdotally from what we have seen, a lot of these sites just haven't been up to par. The court ruled just a month ago that one of the quarantine sites had to actually be closed because they couldn't adequately provide for the people that were quarantined there, provide the necessary food, nutrition, etc. And that's what same we saw in our case in Limpopo with those two medical doctors. Unfortunately, they just didn't have access to what a normal individual in those circumstances required access to. And of course, that infringes on their dignity, their privacy, and a range of other constitutional rights.
All right, I guess we'll see how this continues to unfold. Thank you very much for your time. Certainly appreciate your insights. Dr. William Oosthuizen is the head of legal at the South African Medical Association. Appreciate your time indeed.